Testing. Oh, there's me. Look at all you people skipping church. Welcome. Welcome to our discussion today. My name is Jane Sims. I am the reporter with the London Free Press. And it is a pleasure to see all of you here. And because I think there's a lot of curious people here who have some interest in one of the darkest times in recent London history. And we're going to talk about that today, but before we do, I want to introduce our guests. First of all, sitting here right to my left is Michael Arntfield. For those of you who don't know Mike, Mike is a former London police officer, and he's now a criminologist, author, Western professor, consultant, newbie surfer, I hear too, right? He recently returned from Australia, and where he helped train a cold case task force. I think you've seen Mike in the press and on the news, and he has taught throughout the continent and founded the Cold Case Society at Western, and has partnered with the Murder Accountability Project in Washington, D.C. So TV pundit, the creator of the show To Catch a Killer, and author of 3 books, including the 2015 bestseller, Murder City. Please welcome Michael Arntfield. Also with me is Vanessa Brown. For those of you who don't know Vanessa, Vanessa is a lifelong Londoner and author with a curiosity and passion for local history. She's written a book that is the definitive history on Hotel London, and co-authored London, 150 Cultural Moments with her husband, Jason Dixon.
That's right.
Together, they own and operate the Brown and Dixon bookstore in the heart of Richmond Row, which I'm sure all of you have been to. And her latest book pieces together the terrible events here in London in the late 1960s and 1970s, and it's called The Forest City Killer. So please welcome Vanessa Brown. I made notes. I also want to acknowledge a couple other people who are here today. One who I haven't seen yet, but one I have, and I'll start with the one I have. And Anne English. Please welcome Anne. She is Jackie English's older sister, and with her brother. Along with her brother Fred, they've worked tirelessly to make sure that Jackie's story has never been forgotten. And Anne, every year Anne organizes a walk on Wellington Road over the Wellington Street overpass on the night that Jackie disappeared, and to remember her so we don't forget her, that we don't forget what happened to her. And so Anne, it's great that you're here. Is Denny here? There he is. I knew you'd be here, Denny. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Denny Elsop Jr. And Denny is, and Sandy. Hi, Sandy. His lovely wife, Sandy, is here too. Now, Denny's kind of ground zero here for us. But anyway, he inherited a keen sense of justice and perseverance from his dad, OPP Superintendent Dennis Elsop Sr. And after his dad died, Dennis recognized that a box of notes and diaries from his father's policing days could hold the keys to many of the unsolved homicides in this city. And those notes have come to be the basis of both Mike and Vanessa's work, and are symbolic of the immense efforts that went into tracking down what happened here in London during a very, very dark time. Denny, great to have you here. Okay. And one more, is Rod Keith here? No. Rod's not here, okay. I wanted to recognize Rod too, because he's kind of, I would say, the godfather of the local amateur sleuthing community, and he has done enormous amounts of work in making sure that these stories get told. So with all those introductions, welcome, and we are going to have, I hope, a spirited conversation about what happened here in the 60s and the 70s. Some of you may have lived through those times. Some of you may just be learning about them now, but we're going to try to understand what happened, why it happened, and why we haven't been able to solve these cases. And both Mike and Vanessa can give us a good perspective on that. So I'm going to start out with a question, but if any of you want to jump in, if you have a question, I am more than willing not to be doing the talking here. So let's get at it a bit here, okay? So I think where I want to start is the city has evolved and changed and over 50 years. And I mean, I'm wearing my button today, and I hope you saw I wore my button for Jackie. 50 years since Jackie's death. So many of those names, like Jackie English and Jackie Dunleavy and Frankie Jensen and Linda White, Scott Leishman, Bruce Stapleton, these are all young people who died during that time. They're fading or have faded into the city's history. Over the years, there have been several police cold case task forces that have taken another look at these unsolved homicides, but I can only think of 2 that were solved. But here's what I want to ask. Are these approaches effective, these cold case restoration projects? And with the new investigative tools available that weren't available to Dennis Alsop Sr., and modern technology, is it worth to try this again?
I guess I'll go first.
Go ahead, Mike.
So yeah, cold case task forces, I can think of 2, Project Angel, which was based in London, and Project Millennium, which looked at the entire province. These both, and the name Millennium I think captures it, they both sort of crystallize around 1999, which is when the DNA databank went online in Canada, the National DNA Databank. And really, all cold case task forces anywhere are chiefly DNA driven. There's only a handful of permanent cold case units globally. So I'm thinking robbery homicide in LA has a cold case division within it. Again, they vet cases based solely on DNA. So DNA, so YSTR DNA, so nuclear DNA, the offender DNA that forms the data bank, has really been sort of the engine behind these projects. The task force I was attached to in Western Australia is 80 detectives full-time, and they look at non-DNA cases, or cases where DNA can be recovered using unconventional means. So I guess the short version is we've been overly, I think, focused on DNA cases. Until DNA, all cases were solved circumstantially. And I would suggest that, in fact, DNA can be a bit of a distraction in that some of the best prosecutions now rely on, so I'm thinking of no-body homicides, for instance, a couple of which are mentioned in Murder City, are all solved and prosecuted circumstantially. So that's what was exciting about what was going on in Australia, and what I want to bring back here is you need to throw sufficient resources at it. You need full-time commitment. You need continuity of the same investigators over time. You can't just throw together people from disparate units and expect them to hit the ground running and solve these cases. And that's why they've been chiefly focused on the science. There are other tools, I think, and some of, we can't get into all of them now, but there are tools discussed in the book in which I advocate for during my outreach and in my lectures that I think can be used. And then I would like to see a permanent provincial task force, not unlike we see in, like I said, in Australia.
There doesn't seem to be the will to do that, though. Why do you think there isn't? Is it because of that they're historical now, that there doesn't seem to be a will amongst police agencies to maybe devote people directly to these cases full time?
Well, first of all, there are individuals who have the will, right? So people join law enforcement because they want to make a difference. So there's no point in sitting back and bashing the police. We are the people who have to make that decision. We are the people who create the will to put together a cold case task force in Ontario. And this is something I've heard repeatedly from individuals like Mike, members of the OPP who have worked with me. We need that dedicated cold case squad. There is one in Quebec. There are lots of places that have them. Why don't we have one? Where is that will come from? Okay, well, we can look up at the government and say, why aren't you doing this? The government's yours. You do it. Make them do it. Yes! Thank you. Something that is easy to forget, we think these cases are 50 years old and we've got current cases we need to deal with, right? Oh, that guy's probably dead. Well, okay, but whoever did this in London, who murdered our children, went on and did it somewhere else, right? And we let them. So let's stop them.
I'm going to just add to that. So, first of all, we know that, so we talk about competing priorities. For the same reasons Vanessa mentioned, someone decided a few years ago that you needed a cop in every high school. And that's sort of just carried on. For years, it's no longer in existence. There was a police officer in uniform stationed full-time at the safety village at Fanshawe Park and conservation area. And I mean, rumor has it, I can't verify this, but some high-ranking officer said, what actually goes on out there? And drove out there one day unannounced and caught him cross-country skiing.
That sounds like a pretty nice job.
Yeah, well, so that's done. But again, we take these plum sort of patronage appointments that exist within police departments, I think, for granted in reality, subject to demand. Those same resources can be allocated for something like cold cases. And the argument is, well, there's competing resources now, there's active cases now. It's interesting that very busy municipalities and police departments like the LAPD, like I mentioned, still think it's worthwhile. And they think it's worthwhile because the data is very clear. The greater the number of unsolved, uncleared homicides in a city, generally speaking, the lower the solved rate is overall moving forward, and the higher the overall homicide rate is. So having unsolved, uncleared, cold case homicides still on the books actually has a pernicious effect on the ability of a department to operate effectively, and that the data on that is very clear.
Jane, you asked too if these cases can be solved, and I think Mike and I both know these cases can be solved. In fact, we know that they have the evidence that they need to solve them. So why aren't they? It's time and resources. And there are individuals who are putting forth, here is the DNA to test, please test it. That DNA is not getting tested. Why is that? There has to be a systemic issue there.
One of the issues is too, resource-wise. I mean, a lot of times we've seen these cold case squads be put together, and there's a flurry to put people together, but they're only together for about 3 years. And you start from ground zero all over again. And the dedication of a long time effort towards solving cases just doesn't happen. That maybe there might be a clue that is there that can be pursued, and yet by the end of the tenure of the project and the money that's allocated to it, those clues just vanish.
Can I speak to that? That's what's so magical about what Dennis did for us, who's here. Dennis found his father's files, and his father worked tirelessly on these cases for decades and was that consistent person who was there when it happened and never gave up on it. So being able to access that treasure trove for a criminologist like Mike or for a writer like me, that's exactly what you're talking about, is that thread through where one person has the passion and then they remember that little detail. Oh yeah, 10 years ago, someone said that to me, and they can put it together. And as long as we're haphazardly handing out these files to different individual officers, and it changes every 4 years. I mean, you can't keep track of who has the case.
So, yeah, institutional continuity, that's the biggest issue, and there's actually a study forthcoming in the Journal of Homicide Studies where I'm on the editorial board there, so I reviewed it. I guess I'm not supposed to reveal what I review, but it's supposed to be secret. But anyways, the number one complaint from cold case survivors, and I know Anne English can probably attest to this, is that lack of continuity. And it undermines their faith in the police and that they're keeping true to their word to solve the case. I mean, the horror stories I hear where someone promises, I'm going to solve this case, I will work it for years. They don't hear anything, they call back, they find out the officer's retired. No notice, no nothing in there. And then they're re-explaining it all over again to whoever has inherited it, has no knowledge, no existent knowledge. And doing this a dozen times in 5-6 years, you can imagine just how demoralizing that is. So number one, it has a problem, obviously, on the solvability of cases, but number two, it has a very deleterious negative effect on, I think, public and survivors' perceptions of what the police are actually doing.
But let me play a little bit of devil's advocate here, though, too. I mean, this city is not what it was in 1969, right? This is a much larger. What was London back in '69? About 160,000 people, and we're now a city of about 400,000. We have gone through an evolution of social change and where people live and how people are perceived. And for a lot of people who live in the city, names like Jackie English are new to them when they read about the walk along the Wellington Road overpass. But if we take our mind back to then, it occurs to me, even in talking to some of the old timers from the Free Press who covered these cases, I mean, as the body count got bigger, right? I mean, there was lots of coverage and lots of stories, but there seems to be in the city, it was more, I get a sense of it being a curiosity more than a public health crisis. And I'll go as far as to say it was a public health crisis. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that was? Was it just too much? Was it too overwhelming for this community to bear down and try to figure this all out? Or was it simply just because people were minding each other's business, didn't want to step into anybody else's business and try to reach out and figure out what was happening here? I'll throw that to you first, Vanessa, if you want to try that one out.
Sure. I think, first of all, we tend to think that's not my job, or that piece of information I have isn't that important. So, we think the police are going to handle it, and we just let them. But we have to create the safe communities we want to live in, right? So that's the first thing. And talking about it and sharing information amongst each other is how you do that. But, I mean, is your question really like why? We're talking about cops who had like a grade 10 education, or has anyone watched Peaky Blinders? I'm watching that show right now, okay? I mean, the police are essentially just like bouncers, right?
It certainly wasn't as sophisticated of a profession as it is now.
No, and we were talking about this before we came out here. We're expecting so much of our police officers now. We're expecting them to be social workers, crowd control, taking care of absolutely everything. And they're people like you or me. And they went and did the schooling and got the job. And we need to respect our men and women in uniform, absolutely. But in 1969, there were very different qualifications to become a police officer. And I think it was Rod Keith who told me there wasn't a single police officer in London who was trained in homicide. That's why they brought in the OPP, right? So we're asking, why didn't they get it done then? I don't know. Mike, you can speak to that. You've got a different piece of information. That was what Rod told me, so I don't know.
Well, and I also think too, I mean, that if I put on my little feminism hat for a second, I mean, I don't think women were valued. I don't think that there was I think women were fairly disposable in children, and there wasn't that. I think there was a sense of urgency, but there wasn't the sense of trying to get it solved. Does that make sense, Mike? Or am I overthinking this?
I talk about this in Murder City. I proffer a theory. I look at comparatively London versus other consumer test market cities. So Youngstown, Ohio, Muncie, Indiana, and most notably Rochester, New York, which has remarkably similar patterns in serial homicide and unsolved homicide and social problems. And people forget London is a consumer test market city. A lot of products are beta tested and piloted here before they go national. So everything from weekend banking or tap to the McRib. So
Johnny Cash. Who remembers the Johnny Cash machines?
Yeah.
Cities are earmarked for this because they offer a certain degree of what we call consumer market segmentation. Another way to describe it is what you call social balkanization. People are very isolated. There's X number of retired people, X number of students, X number of middle class, X number of welfare recipients. And what this does is, and this is why it's appealing to marketers, is essentially you have these siloed communities within a city, what we call balkanization, and they don't really talk to each other. And we see that quite clearly in that, and it's talked about in the book as sort of a good thing, but I guess it's a double-edged sword in that the now defunct block parent program also started in London because of what was happening to children. And you think, well, that's a great grassroots initiative, but then the second thought is, why do you need a sign in the window and a concerted effort to keep children safe? And you can only run if you're being pursued by a stranger to a house with a block parent sign. Why did it come to that you actually had to impose this structural system versus in other cities, neighbors keep an eye for the children, or every house is a safe haven for a child in danger. So, I mean, I think that speaks to the underlying fact that there was, I think, a lack of informal social controls in this city, in that you needed to come up with a formal social control, so a program, versus how about you're aware of what goes on in your own backyard.
Those silos made it, well, we did, because we didn't talk to each other too, made it pretty attractive for if you wanted to kill people too.
Precisely.
Absolutely.
And it still goes on today. I mean, you've got garish McMansion upon McMansion in what was a cornfield 6 months ago being built in the north end of the city, and you have an IV drug epidemic downtown and a train still running through the middle of the city. It really is. I say it. I mean, I've said it before. London really, and I don't know if everyone will get these references, but is sort of a combination of David Lynch's Twin Peaks and South Park. It's,
That's exactly right. Yeah, Jason calls it Mellonville, like SCTV, right? Yeah.
I want to talk about writing about true crime. And I want it because both of you, of course. And if you haven't seen the books, you haven't got the books are available here. We love to see local authors succeed here in London, Ontario, so buy your books today if you came here. But I want to talk about the barriers and the advantages about writing about your hometown. You're both Londoners. And is it more difficult to write about your hometown or easier to write about your hometown? And if you guys can kind of talk to everyone about that process and what you had to do. Who wants to start? I'll give you the...
Sure. When it comes to, okay, so we're talking about writing about my hometown. Are we going to write about talking about true crime next?
Well, let's talk about writing about your hometown first of all.
Yeah, because there are certain barriers to writing about true crime in Canada that I think we could talk about. But writing about London, I think I was able to unearth stuff that I wouldn't have been able to unearth anywhere else. When you're writing about history, being familiar with that place really helps. So, when I'm reading descriptions of local areas or I need to describe an area, I've been there 100 times, so it's much easier than if I was researching a city I wasn't from. The other thing, though, is having lived in London my whole life, you know people, and so that those connections, those community connections come in really, really handy. Things like just remembering, like, oh, I'm at a party, there's Mary Faulkner. Aha, I know who that is. Not everyone from London would know who that is, right? And so you can go and talk to them. Or, knowing, oh, that's just around the corner, I can walk there. So that makes it accessible. I've only written about London, though, so...
Well, let me ask this. When you're writing about more sensitive material, and I'll say this as a newspaper reporter, and I'll say this as a newspaper reporter who grew up in a rural area outside of the city, I have found that the biggest obstacle to getting information is that everybody wants to know what's going on, but nobody wants to tell you anything.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And also, like people think, oh, that's not a very important information. Oh, that's just a little tidbit, But that little story about getting drunk at the West End at Hotel London and then walking down to the Stanley Variety to see the porn theater, that's huge. Because to me, that was only the second time I'd had that confirmed. I've had it confirmed now 3 times, once last week. So those stories we don't write that down in history books, especially when you're dealing with the time in policing where instead of making a report, you might take the perp out in the back alley and give them a thump, So speaking to each other is how we retain that information. That's our oral history tradition. But when it comes to the sensitive material, more important than the community at large is important that way. When you write about where you're from and you work in a public-facing business, people will constantly come in and tell you what you got wrong. So far,
Try being a newspaper reporter.
Yeah, constant typo.
I swear I'm the stupidest person in London.
No, this book I did pretty well. We had a great team of editors who helped make sure that most of it came through unscathed. The bigger issue, though, I think, is dealing with victims' families, people who've been through trauma. So, I've had on the 2 extreme ends, I've had on one extreme end, yes, tell all the gory details. Make it as dramatic as possible because I want people to know how horrific this was. You know, I've been through this pain. This is the truth. Put the truth out there. On the other hand, I've had, how dare you write about my family? And I mean, I've been torn off one. So you get both ends of the spectrum. So to me, that's the trickier aspect of writing about a place where you live, because you know you have easier access to the people who are actually involved in what happened. And when you're dealing with child murder, it's the worst thing that can happen. That's the worst thing that can happen.
Mike, did you have any kind of experience like that? I mean, I know that your approach comes from the academic side of this, but still, this is where you grew up too, and there's a lot of haunts here that you would know, and places that you can connect to, and even as a police officer. Was there any difficulty that you experienced regarding having to write about those things and living here in London?
Not particularly. I mean, for the same reasons Vanessa described. I mean, I think you have a greater sense of duty to the community and to tread carefully, and in part because, I mean, you're sort of writing about your own history as well a little bit. There is an inevitable autobiographical dimension to it, even if you're not inserted in there. I mean, just even as trying to establish a reliable narrator's voice, saying that, yeah, this is, you know, what was at the Twilight Drive-In on that night on this date, and I can tell you that with, you know, authenticity. So I think authenticity is really required to be imparted if you're living in the place. Murder City was the first of a series of city books that are all about people going above and beyond to solve an epidemic of serial murder, all based on true events, obviously. So I've lived in two of those cities. The most recent one, Monster City, about Nashville. So I wrote that while living in Nashville as a visiting professor at Vanderbilt, and had access to police there and worked with a detective there. The middle one, Mad City, about Madison, Wisconsin, I did not live in. I visited, but for that reason, a very different experience. And I think I feel also very differently about that book, in that I don't see myself there. I have no
You're not as connected?
I'm not as connected, and it shows up even in the style, in the prose, where sort of I play. I guess it's all. I mean, it was fact checked and legal read to death, but you can sort of play a little fast and loose with people's descriptions and things of that nature, in that you're not, I think, as personally soldered to the people and places.
Now, I'm going to ask both of you about, you know, I know that you come at it in different ways in terms of theory. And, you know, we either have one killer or we have a bunch of killers here. And, you know, in trying to, well, I guess I want you to talk about sort of the thesis that you have, and in terms of how you see this played out, whether that we see that this was just a good place and easy pickings for people who wanted to do horrendous things, or if there was one person who had masterminded this to a point that we couldn't pick them off.
Well, so obviously my book covers 25 years in the title, but more accurately, closer to 40 years, where I look at a number of cases that bookend this epidemic period. Vanessa's, as I understand, zeroes in on 2 years, correct?
Pretty much.
So, I mean, in that, so just take the canonical 25-year period, there's 29 victims. Well, there's far more than that, but there's 29 victims of what are clearly either speculative or confirmed serial crimes, all of whom are women and children. So the question is, do you have one person who's killed 29 people, or do you have multiple killers? Well, we know, first of all, that a couple have been identified. We know from DNA that there are at least two others, because they're different DNA profiles. I don't want to get too much into specific cases, because, I mean, what's written has been sort of closely scrutinized and vetted, but I don't want to sort of go off on a tangent orally without sort of restraining myself. So basically, the science supports credible anecdotal evidence, convictions, and science support a minimum of 6 offenders operating near contemporaneously in the city. I've hypothesized 9. And that's because there are a couple of cases where there's absolutely no question. They killed once in London, and they have killed before. There's absolutely no question. The specificity of the ritual and the post-mortem behavior with the body and transportation and posing and things that are very, very rare in murder generally, and we know are correlated with a very specific type of offender. So for instance, in 2014, Behavior Analysis Unit Team 4, so that is the FBI unit that looks at serial offenders, basically the real-life version of what you see on Criminal Minds, commissioned a study, and they looked at what do serial offenders have in common who exhibit certain characteristics. So for instance, driving a body more than 4 kilometers and concealing it either in water, in brush, or burying it. People who do that go on to kill an average of 4 victims before they're identified and arrested. So when we see that show up in London, and then that person, we know from DNA that they haven't killed anyone else in London. We know, again, based on looking at hundreds of cases in the United States, that they have just simply moved on and carried on with that elsewhere.
Although, there is one anomaly that you and I both know, and that's the Linda Shaw case. Is it not?
That is. He actually went, so when you look at, she was disposed of at the scene and desecrated at the scene. Again, that is another pattern that BAU4 looked at. And he fits all the characteristics: previous convictions, history of psychiatric intervention, not employed. This is how specific you can get in terms of common characteristics among offenders who exhibit those behaviors. What's interesting is he is a serial killer. I don't know, it's in the book. I don't think it's widely known that the Linda Shaw case is solved. It's no longer a cold case.
No one read the Free Press.
That case is solved. She was murdered. I mean, this is public knowledge. She was murdered by a convicted 2-time murderer who...
Alan Craig MacDonald.
Right. Yep. Who murdered a police officer and a cab driver in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and was paroled to a halfway house in Brantford because, in the infinite wisdom of the National Parole Board, was at low risk to reoffend. And the first thing he does is he sets up at what's now the En Route near Woodstock and just started shopping for young women who were there alone, disabled her vehicle, and then attacked her, which then, that being his second set of killings, made him a serial killer, and he committed suicide a short time later.
And in that case, too, I mean, then he laid low for a long time, and he was only identified after he took his own life. And there was DNA evidence.
And there was DNA evidence, and what the most troubling thing about that is, and this is why the answers are out there, and you don't have to look too far. He was identified as a person of interest through some good detective work early on. 2 cops went to see him. So they said, can we have your, this was early DNA. No data bank, but you could still do comparative analysis. They said, can we have a piece of your hair for DNA analysis? He says, much like Bernardo. They went to Bernardo and said, can we take your DNA? He says, sure. They pluck a hair, they put it in an envelope, put it in a drawer, and it stayed there for 10 years.
And it was a piece of hair that had a follicle to it.
Yeah.
Thank goodness. If it didn't have a follicle, they wouldn't have got him.
So he had been, by the time someone inherited that desk, opened it up and said, what's this hair doing here? And had the prescience to send it off for analysis, he was already dead. And they were able to confirm posthumously that he was the killer. And were it not for Linda Shaw's mother leaking that to the Toronto Sun, the public was never going to be made aware that it was solved. And obviously, the murmurs that I heard in the room, a lot of people still don't know because it was kept pretty high and tight.
Yeah, that was a day the OPP announced that the case had been solved, but for privacy reasons, they couldn't release the name of the killer. They said he was dead. And I can recall coming back in a car with fellow reporter Randy Richmond, and the two of us going, we couldn't believe that this was happening, that we couldn't identify who the person was. We got it.
The case, the jurisprudence is clear, and the entire Western Hemisphere, you cannot defame or libel a dead person. So naming him would have had no legal consequence. They just chose not to.
Vanessa, I'm going to open it up to you about what your findings are and how you see this how this played out in the late 60s and early 70s.
Well, I think I took some inspiration from Michelle McNamara, who, in rebranding Irons as the Golden State Killer, really brought enough public pressure to that case that it was solved. And, naming the book naming the evil that was in the city, the four-city killer, is intended to do that. I think it's pretty clear when you read the book that I don't think it was one person, but it's a great title. But even like the New York Times didn't recognize that I said specifically, maybe she didn't finish it, that I didn't think it was one person, but that's okay. So no, I agree with Mike wholeheartedly, but I do think all of this needs to be retested. I mean, we're talking about DNA tests that were done 20 years ago. We're talking about, when I was chatting with Paul Holes about the case, and he was talking about how difficult it is to take proper internal sperm samples, or all the different biological samples they had to take from these cases, and how easy it is for those samples to be compromised, especially over the years with that, like Helga Beer, of course. If you haven't seen Mike's interview about Helga Beer, you should Google that. The evidence needs to be looked at with fresh eyes, probably non-Ontario eyes that haven't seen it before, and re-examined fully with new technology. Because when you're talking about genetic testing 20 years ago, that's just ridiculous. I wouldn't ask you to use a laptop from 20 years ago. So we need to re-examine all of this with new technology. And this is where citizen sleuthing comes in, right? This is where non-law enforcement investigation comes in. The Golden State Killer was caught, of course, with help from a genealogist who is not a member of the law enforcement community. So there are experts, academics, scientists, people in all sorts of professions who can help solve these cases who don't work for the London Police Department. So why aren't we enlisting them? Or for the OPP, frankly, because these cases are in OPP jurisdiction.
Can I just talk for a second about that time again? Does it not strike you that there was a lot of weird stuff going on in London at that
Oh my Lord,
time?
it's crazy. Has anyone gone through microfiche? Have you microfished? Okay. It blinds you, like it's blinding. Okay, so I got into the fires for a little bit. I got really nerdy, and went full on down rabbit holes when I was, there was a moment where I was pulling out boxes about summer camps and it's crazy. So I really got into the fires, and for a while when I was going through the microfiche looking for little articles and mentions I might have missed, I noticed there were all these fires all the time. So right around the time Jackie Dunleavy and Frankie Jensen are taken, there's this spate of variety store fires, specifically variety store arsons. I thought, I need to track these. So I start writing them down. And then you notice, there's another missing kid. Is this a murder? I've never heard of this missing kid. Did they ever find this kid? Start writing down the name. You can't find anything about that person. I mean, we talk about how things were better and happy. No. You open up a newspaper from 1968 in London, Ontario, and every other day you've got a fire, you've got a missing child, you've got a murder, you've got a robbery. I mean, it is terrifying what was going on. But again, the silo, people didn't talk about it. And when I talk to members of the community, which is my main focus, because that's what gets me really jazzed, is what you tell me that story, what do you know? Okay, cool. People either say, yeah, I knew about that. My mom was terrified. She wouldn't let me go anywhere by myself. Or they say, I had no idea. Right? So it's like two different Londons.
And it was that idea too that and it comes up in both your books that when young people would simply vanish, there was a thinking is they ran away. They've joined the hippies. They'll turn up sometime.
Oh,
right?
it's so
It was really
it's
very
super
strange to me.
And it's early, like Georgia Jackson, right? So anyone who's read Four City Killer or Murder City, frankly, has read about Chief Henderson in Elmer. And there's Georgia's gone. She's a sweet religious girl. Never had a boyfriend. Never
Lives
had
with
a
her
drink.
parents.
Lives with her parents. Goes to church. She's training to go into the ministry. Up and disappears on the coldest night of the year. And they're like, she just is kind of thing. No. She's gone. And then they get a terrifying phone call saying, I'm being held downtown by two men. And he still says it's a crank call. It's not until the OPP are called in.
Although there were a lot of prank calls. There's a lot of strange people doing a lot of cranking back then.
Yeah, I've had 3 psychics in the last month come up to me. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting people out there. But
and that struck me too. I mean, that strikes me as how many people, and Anne will attest to this, that would kind of we talk about people not sticking their nose into things, but other people who stuck their nose in things that they shouldn't have been, they would trying to stir the pot up almost.
Oh, like Betty Harrison, right, Mike?
Well, that's a crazy story. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, during this period, we see, so first of all, obscene telephone calling, which was dismissed as a nuisance, and we now understand is part of a disorder called scatologia, which is actually a very high-risk precursor to serious violent sexual offending. That was, I would deem, a London pastime for many years. I mean, I remember getting them. But we see some things show up in London that for the first time in terms of criminal activity. So I mentioned in the book, I mean, other than what was going on with the Boston Strangler, so I mean, Albert DeSalvo, who eventually is deemed the Boston Strangler matched by DNA to the final victim, probably just killed the final victim. The consensus is there was probably 3 Boston Stranglers, and they were all just copycatting each other and once the media leaked the MO. And we see that show up for the first time in Canadian history in London in 1968 with when the MO, or actually what would be a signature involving the Dunleavy murder with tissue being inserted in her throat post-mortem, is then picked up on by somebody else and uses that method to artificially link those cases.
And very quickly, too.
Within a month.
Yeah. Does anybody want to weigh in here? I'm sure you all have questions. Yes, Danny?
You knew I'd weigh in.
Absolutely.
With the files that we're talking about, and we're talking about continuity with the OPP, and they have to have the same people. When the OPP finally came to look at my Jackie English file, they said to me, "Why didn't you get a hold of us first?" And I said to them, "A, you should have this file. I've got the 4th copy. The other thing is, I'm wasting my time dealing with you. They've got to let their files be open to people like Mike so that they can find these things. They're looking at closed eyes. They don't want to look at it. All they're worried about is another trust stock fiasco. They've got to change their ways, and they don't like me."
We love you, Danny. Okay. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to ask, you were talking about that Western Australia task force and their non-DNA. And just when you're talking now about people should be involved and then people shouldn't be involved, it's never as clean. I used to like new tricks on English TV about a task force for cold cases. They all solve it in an hour. The problem is, trying to decide who should be involved and who shouldn't. It's never as clean as you want, right?
Well, this, sorry, Mike, just before you even answer that, because Mike obviously has the right answer for that. But even doing the work I've been doing as a complete amateur, I have to push aside people who want to contribute, who are actually just taking up time away from what could be productive investigation, right? So, and I mean, I'm a writer. Mike's obviously the professional. So there are people who insert themselves constantly, like we were just talking about. So deciding, but then you don't want to discount someone because someone might come to you and say, "Oh, I have information," and they might present to somebody who's an oddball or might be wanting to waste your time, but they might actually have something really valuable to say. So you're right, it's very difficult to tell.
I think, so I just did a series of presentations in Australia on this, and I've got some more next week. Part of the problem in staffing cold case task forces is, believe it or not, there is no standard universal definition of what constitutes a cold case. Different agencies have different criteria. I've proposed a standardized, simplified definition, which is 12 months with no update to the investigative chronology. The original investigator is no longer assigned to the case, so that continuity has been lost, and there is no pending scientific examination of any exhibit, so there's no DNA. I think if we can agree on that, I mean, I've seen some very off-the-wall definitions, like it's got to be 10 years, and
10 years?
Yeah.
That's kind of...
Well, I mean, because the ongoing platitude offered by certain police departments is this is an active and ongoing investigation and we can't discuss it. And that's
heard
bullshit.
that before.
Yeah. And I mean,
As Anne says, it's open, but it's not active.
so using my definition, okay, if it's active, when was the last interview conducted? When was the last time an exhibit was retested based on current adequacy standards at the Center for Forensic Science versus 20 years ago? So no, frequently when you hear that, it's a complete lie.
Well, and Billy Jensen's been looking at this too, right? When he's using social media to track, like Billy's more like, he's not a cop, he's a writer, a much more venerated writer than me, but coming at it from that angle. And he'll find cases that, because we've all heard the 48 hours, right? 6 months later, there's maybe surveillance video, there's a photograph, there's something where you think they should have caught this guy. So he's looking at cases that are 6 months old, right? So they're still fresh in people's memories. So when you're talking about what is a cold case, I mean, maybe instead of calling it a cold case, we should be looking at, when do you need to enlist someone other than the police? They've tried every avenue.
Right, because there are cases, and I will say this, Mike and I were talking about this before we came out here. I just finished covering a murder trial, 2 murder trials here in the city involving the same man who killed 2 people, and it took 7 years for him to be convicted for murdering Jonathan Zack up in northeast London. And in that case, it was absolutely clear that there was some extraordinary police work done. It's just there wasn't enough there. And there was a lot of great work done over a lot of years to bring that man to justice. So sometimes as a cold case, what we can perceive as cold isn't cold yet, correct?
So without discussing that case too much, I mean, I can tell you from experience, a small cadre of detectives who took that case very personally.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I think absent that, they do go cold. When you don't have that personal investment, that fire for seeing a case through to fruition, and again, that's where the continuity comes in. Had either of those key investigators been transferred out or shunted in somewhere else, whoever replaced them does not have that encyclopedic knowledge of the case required in order to sort of mentally map it and keep everything in check and be able to push it to the wall the way they did.
Absolutely.
Can I ask Mike a question?
Well, I guess, Vanessa.
What's your Rebecca case? What's the one you can't let go of?
Tons. I mean, obviously,
personal.
all the ones in Murder City, obviously. A couple from Nashville. And to be honest, the case that's bothering me the most right now, and here's a good question, if this would be deemed cold or not, is, and I don't know who here's heard of it, but if you haven't, you need to look it up. It's only about a year old, the Delphi, Indiana Valentine's Day double murder. And you know it?
I don't know it in depth like you.
So basically the Coles notes is 2 girls are out for a walk, grade school girls, and what's chilling is they're Snapchatting their walk together, and you can see in one of the images the killer waiting off in the woods for them. And and then I think it is still Snapchat. There's an audio recording of him telling them to get down the hill. All you hear is a male voice saying, "Get down the hill." They don't get his face, but they get his voice. So they've got a voice imprint, they've got an image of him at a distance, and they have DNA. And this is a town of like 10,000 people, and he's vanished. They had a suspect briefly in Colorado who was a drifter. Clearly, this person's not local. But the fact that this is still unsolved is bothersome.
You had a question?
Yes, I do. To do with Murder City, in that book, you talked about the 2 psychiatric patients in St. Thomas who were released together and came to North London and abducted a young girl. In that, you made a comment, so I'm wondering if you want that information and if it's important, that you would like to know who the bright lights were on the committee that chose to release them. And that committee had been told by a lawyer never to release them, and certainly never to release them together. Is the name of one of those people on that committee important, and do you already have it?
We may have some news here.
That maybe for in private later on. That would be, but I did not actually know. So my father prosecuted that case, and I'm not sure even he knew about that they had been counseled to not release them together, because certainly it was, I mean, a reasonable person would have predicted that would have led to something bad, and it's just a stroke of luck that girl was not killed and that they didn't go on and attack other people. So we can talk after. Thank you.
Over here, I saw you before. Yes.
Yeah, actually, I have
these horrendous things that you see?
Everybody asks me that. You know what? There's a very small ecosystem internationally of people who do what I do, and I know most of them. And you know what's funny is they're all kind of, there's a couple people I would deem rivals who are kind of pains in the ass, but generally speaking, they're very down to earth, happy-go-lucky people. And I think when you spend your time immersed in this, you begin to appreciate the smaller things in life. And I mean, if you don't get to this point if you're, I think, taking it home all the time. I mean, it would chew you up inside. And I credit, actually, obviously, my background in police work as probably having thickened my skin enough to get to this point. But I mean, a lot of my colleagues, especially in the US, are strictly scientists and academics and have no sort of field experience. And I'm amazed at how easily they're able to compartmentalize and just sort of leave it at work and then, you know, focus on the things that matter personally when they're on their own time.
That's why you go surfing, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
that's
Indian
why you go
Ocean
surfing.
is daunting.
Yeah.
Do not try surfing there.
See,
There's stuff there that you don't ever want to see again.
Mike's lucky because it's his job. See, because it's not my job. So for me, I am taking it home. So, wine. You know, I mean, I'm
Parenting.
sure
You know,
that.
I will say this is some of the stuff that I get asked a
Yeah.
variation of that question, and the answer that I always give is that it's not my life.
Yeah,
right?
that helps.
I mean,
yeah.
and I have a whole other life out there that demands my attention. That you can't allow yourself. I mean, there's only a certain. You only got a certain amount of yourself, right? You can't piece that out to people all the time, to everybody, right? And it sounds maybe cruel, but that's the truth, right?
But for these guys, it's their job. And when you're not, if you decide to take on any sort of citizen sleuthing, it does get in there. It's a problem. Yeah.
I already said right here.
I actually have a question for both Mike and Vanessa. So right now we have 5 people missing in the city of London, and 2 of them are known as sex workers. And I would argue that London really hasn't changed much from the 60s, from the late 60s. I still think that we are still there are 2 Londons, and I see that quite often where I'll go out of the downtown area and I will meet people I've never seen before, and they're talking about things I have no idea what they're talking about. So I just wanted to know what your comments on that, if you think that London is the same, have we improved? What do we need to, well, that's a big question, what do we need to change that?
I'll maybe jump in first. I was actually going to talk earlier about the issue with missing persons still today. I mean, we talk about, you know, the token answer was, they must have run away, despite no history of that behavior. And I frequently get calls from national media about other cases elsewhere in Canada, and it's a national problem in that there is not, I mean, I think people see on TV, you know, missing persons squads, and you know that people are all over this. Missing persons investigations in Canada is a very loose patchwork of different standards for what constitutes sort of urgent or emergent circumstances versus who's at risk versus what merits an immediate investigation versus what merits a sit and wait. So it's an issue, and I don't have a single answer for it, and that's normally the answer I give. In terms of London, I think we're seeing a new London in terms of the same systemic issues that led to this spate of serial sexual homicide are just rearing their heads in a different fashion now. The social problems and the segmentation that is going on in this city, like I mentioned, you know, you want a vinyl-sided McMansion in a cornfield, great, and that's aspirational here versus fixing, you know, the real issues. And I mean, I had a film crew come down here for a series that I'm filming, Mummy Mysteries, actually. We're looking at 3,000-year-old cold cases. It's actually quite interesting. The same methodology can be applied to mummified remains, and we're rewriting history. But their perspective as Brits and Americans was, like, they were driving around and they said, like, when we pictured Canada, we didn't picture this. And that they weren't being flattering. Like, it's not what people think it is.
It's so true. A camera crew came to do, well, you met them too. There was you'll see, it'll come out. We're both on it. And the camera guy they were staying downtown, and he saw Dundas and Wellington, and he said, "What is this, East Hastings?" You know, like, it's absurd. But you know, when it comes to the sex workers and the crimes that are going on, I mean, the 401 is still an issue. And I think something that fascinates me personally is the long-haul truck driving industry and its relationship to serial homicide and sexual homicide. So, of course, stuff happens in London that we don't know about, that doesn't get reported, because, you know, in addition to taking away the resources of our law enforcement, we love to deplete the resources of our reporters, give them less time and less money to do what they need to do. So, you know, there's all sorts of stuff going on. And yeah, but one of the joys, Shelley, of London is that it delightfully never changes, right? So how many friends do I know who went away in their 20s, you know, to Toronto or Montreal, and they came back in their 30s, you know, to raise their kids and be near their aging parents, and it's exactly the same. There might be a new building, right, or something, but you still go to Scott's Corner for your pint of beer, and you still go to the weird movie theater and the Galleria to go to a cheap movie, and it's the same, and it's always been the same, whether it's Imagine Cinema's Rainbow or the Muse. It's the same $2 movie, right?
Yes, sir.
So from a personal point of view, why has so little been done around Soraya O'Connell? She was a classmate of mine, and I saw her about 2 weeks before she disappeared.
I think Soraya's parents moved back to England, that's my understanding.
No, the father was in the military in Toronto at the time, and actually they relocated to London. He was a guard at the EMDC. That's a good question. And that's a case that was just consigned to the dustbin of this period. And as I speculated in Murder City, I mean, is of extraordinary importance because it's actually sort of the decoder ring that connects a number of murders to a single offender. And at the time, I mean, it was a set of skeletonized remains, and no one wanted to sort of dig into it any further than that. And in reality now, in hindsight, we see just how important it is. But I mean, same with the Stapleton boy. I mean, there's another case that has essentially just been, I mean, I would be surprised, I don't want to divulge too much, but I can state with relative accuracy that no substantive records even exist anymore on that case.
Were you at the party that night?
No, I was not.
Okay. I only have one person who came to me about that dance, and I'd love to know if the information I got was correct. So, because it was all based on, you know, stories people tell. So anyway, if you read it, and if I got her right, please let me know. If I got her wrong, let me know in case there's a revised edition, and I can change my description of her. Because it's important that we remember them as people, and with each victim, as much as possible, I tried to get to know who they were. And Soraya is very elusive and difficult to get to know. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Wait for Mike. And aside from the killers who are dead or incarcerated, what are your thoughts about the likelihood that these killers read your work, follow your work, may have been in touch with you, or could be here today?
No, that's a very good question. I mean, I think about it a fair bit, and not just existing killers, but I mean, my concern is that, and this is a step I take with my cold case think tank at the university, is that someone essentially is homeschooling themselves off my knowledge, and that they intend on weaponizing some of this information, and that they're essentially in waiting. So my concern is, yeah, that, I mean, it's a viable concern. I mean, again, a colleague of mine, Eric Hickey, one of my mentors actually, California State University professor, spent months with Jeffrey Dahmer before he was murdered in prison. Still gets a Christmas card from Dahmer's parents because he was the first person to listen to their son. And we catch homicidal necrophiles faster now based on the information that he provided. He was very cooperative, much like you see Ed Kemper being cooperative in Mindhunter, if you watch that series, which is actually pretty accurate. He got repeated calls at home from Clifford Olson when he was in prison, and Clifford Olson became obsessed with him to the point that when Picton was, and this is just sort of an anecdote, when Picton was arrested and eclipsed Olsen as the most prolific serial killer in Canadian history, Eric knew Cliff would be watching and basically mocked him on live national television. And I mean, it was the sort of cat and mouse game that they had, and I'm looking to avoid officially. But it does.
Oh, you'd love it.
No, it does. It does happen. These people develop imagined or real sort of interest in, obviously, the work of the people who study them, much like we're interested in them.
I'm pretty sure, though, that the main perp that there's a person I have my eyeball on, and I don't think that person has read Murder City or Forest City Killer. I mean, there's a misnomer that all serial killers are super smart, and if you read any of the foundational, they often have a lower IQ than we give them credit for. So you think that they're really smart if they're eluding police, but sometimes it's dumb luck. And I don't know, reading fascinating academic texts like Murder City, it might not quite be their jam.
Yes, right in the middle, glasses. Yes.
This is a question for Vanessa.
Yeah.
I don't usually ask a lot of questions, but I was curious if you knew about the gun store on Arntfield Road near the old Canadian Tire, how it maybe ties in some of the cases that have happened in the city. I don't know if it ties into the Bucks Bomb case.
Oh, no, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
None of the cases I have explored have guns. So no, I'd love to hear more about it, though.
I haven't read your book, but it triggered when you were talking, thinking about the gun store and the interworldly in the Stanley area there, and I'm just curious the weapons and where the people kill, where do they get them from in the city?
Yeah, it's interesting that it was there, right? Like that's a real hot spot of criminal activity right there.
Yeah. The question at the back, red sweater.
Actually, I'm a parent. I'm concerned about the trafficking attempts that have happened in London. I don't know if there's rise or if there's just a rise in reporting last 7 minutes. But I'm just wondering if either of you are considering delving possibly into the facts of it, maybe offering both on the trafficking in London.
So this would go back to, I think, some of the advantages that the city offered for serial offenders. So trafficking, much like child pornography, did not see an uptick just out of nowhere. What's happening is you're seeing an artificial inflation of occurrences because they're finally being reported and investigated. They've always existed, but now these people are showing up, and task forces are being created. I actually just spoke to a task force at the police college, and what I told them was now they're dealing with marginalized persons and at-risk persons in the field, and may actually have an opportunity to, as part of trafficking investigations, identify future serial offenders, because we know that frequently they'll begin with or rely on persons at risk, basically, as they're evolving as offenders. But really the advantage to London being a hub for this is, of course, access to the highway. I mean, London is a Goldilocks city for all types of deviants because of its proximity between Toronto and the US. Highway access is reasonably affordable. And certainly the criminal subculture here that's why we've been able to support all kinds of gang activity for years. And this has been a coveted territory for outlaw motorcycle gangs in particular for that reason. I mean, the FBI in the US has a task force, the Highway Serial Killing Initiative, that has looked at the role of the interstate in human trafficking and serial murder. And they've got about 350 to 400 confirmed serial killers at large now who are in the trucking industry. We don't know their names, but based on DNA profiles and behavioral profiles, we're looking at about 350, 400. The US interstate began construction in 1956. The King's Highway system, with all the London interchanges, opened in 1952. So we were living the reality that now they're aware of in the US much earlier. So when I mentioned criminal copycatting sort of began in Canada here in London, so did all of the epidemics related to highway violence. And I mean, again, there's a task force for this in the US. No one's even discussed this in London, and it's a huge, huge issue.
And just to follow up on that, both Mike and Vanessa chronicle in their books the fact that many of the unsolved homicides here from London people disappeared here in London, but their bodies were found outside of the London city jurisdiction. And that brought in a whole lot of other political problems as well, as far as siloing of police services and the lack of sharing of information that would go on. They sort of figured that out to a point. And I know that Dennis Alsop did an awful lot of work with Bob Young and certain London police detectives, but there was certainly a barrier there that I'm hoping we've kind of solved a little bit. This gentleman here has been one to ask a question.
Vanessa, I had the opportunity of sitting with you in St. Thomas a week or so ago. You talked about David that served 10 years for the murder in Elm, and that he's out and that he's around. But you also indicated that maybe he's involved with some other murders. What's happening as far as pursuing it?
So the question was about a particular individual who was incarcerated regarding murder in 1966. He confessed to it in 1972. And I suspect that individual has committed more murders. Now, of course, that was in a lovely small group of individuals in St. Thomas where I could name names a little more freely. In this forum, I think I'd like to be a little more guarded and say that I hope they're moving towards investigating that individual more thoroughly, and at the very least eliminating them, because everything we've written about is true, right? So if people were unfortunate and had the tremendously unfortunate lack of luck to be in the worst possible place at the worst possible time, that made it seem like they are a likely suspect for the murder and they're entirely innocent, I'm sorry, but you have to be eliminated. So that particular individual, I think, it's key, especially in regards to the Jackie English case. And Lord knows I'm not the first person who's thought it. People have been thinking this for the last 50 years. And for some reason, the evidence hasn't been excluded. But here's the thing, is we like to think that there's this big computer system in the sky, and we put like a little dot of blood in there and a fingerprint, and it will magically match up in this amazing computer system in the sky. It doesn't exist. And I think Canadians, in as much as we don't like talking about all the serial murders in our hometown, we just like to think that the criminal justice system is going to do its job for us, and we let it, right? And then we run into problems like missing and murdered Indigenous women and Tina Fontaine, and then we say, wait a minute, something's not right. This has been busted for ages. So there's a big problem in our system. And I know in the United States, they're heads and tails above where we are in trying to at least even acknowledge that the problem is there and then start to fix it, where the Murder Accountability Project comes into play and other groups like that, where they do employ the expertise of civilians, academics, non-law enforcement members to fix those issues. In Canada, our system is straight up busted. That's why, I don't trust any of the DNA testing that was done 20 years ago. None of it. It all needs to be redone, and frankly, I'd feel more comfortable if someone who wasn't from Ontario did it, because there's a problem, right? How can this individual's DNA be in the hands of law enforcement and not have been tested against this crime scene for over 50 years? That is absurd. So call your MPP, please, and tell them that we need a cold case squad in Ontario. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, this is a province where the chief coroner is now conducting a systematic inquiry into what are called missing murders, because now we're realizing that the murder rate is probably much higher than we thought, because a lot of homicides have been miscoded as undetermined or accidentals or what have you, and a lot of them end up being serial offenders. So Wetlaufer, for instance, had she not confessed?
Had she not confessed, nobody would have.
Those were all ruled natural or accidental deaths. So now we have 8 more murders. Dylan Millard, his first 2 victims, right? Bernardo's first victim, Tammy Homolka.
Bruce MacArthur, someone said, yeah.
Yep, MacArthur. And, you know what it took to get this acknowledged? If you don't know the case already, you need to look up the Johnstone family in Mississauga. 3 members of the same family murdered in the same home in 3 separate incidents in 2 years by the same killer who kept going back and systematically executing this family. And it wasn't until the 3rd victim that the police said, maybe the other ones weren't accidents or natural. And they looked at them. I mean, by the 3rd one, this guy had to have been thinking, why is no one even investigating this? Like, he didn't even have to cover his tracks and he was not a sophisticated offender. So how many others like this are out there? This is what we're dealing with in this province. Never mind the fact that, we are actually 20 to 30 years behind the US in terms of data analytics, in terms of murder. Nobody knows, nobody can state with certainty in this country what the solved rate is on average or what the homicide rate is. It's an absolute mess.
So we're going to take one.
And the Shermans. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the list goes on.
We're going to take one more question, and I can see you. Go ahead.
I just want to say that I'm just totally enjoying this, and I don't know whether that's scary or not, but I think I know that you've been talking the last 50 years specifically, but the case that haunts me to death, and I don't think it was ever solved, was about a little girl in the mid-50s.
Susan
Cadeau.
And she was, I believe, taken from a school on King Street.
It's St. Peter's. Was it not St. Mary's? Carried away from the playground. Yeah.
Down near railway tracks, and I can remember like a lot of Londoners turned out searching for this little girl, and she was found murdered. And if I can recall from the time, the word that was going around was, the fellow that did this, he was from a prominent family and was committed to the Ontario Hospital on Highbury Avenue at the time, and it was all hushed up. I don't know if that was ever solved. I really don't.
I don't think it was, but it does bring up something that I did want to ask is about separating folklore from fact and the difficulty in doing that, because stories, we are a community where all this has happened and we've all talked about it. How difficult is that now, given the amount of time that has passed? I mean, Susan Cadeau died 60 years ago.
So it's difficult, and there's a great example. I can actually tell you, and it's in Murder City. There is DNA in that. It's not cleared, and no one ever went away for it. There's DNA, and it's actually the oldest continuously tested DNA exhibit in the country. In that they were the crime scene work in the 50s. This is the 50s, 56. That they had the presence of mind to preserve the clothing and future-proof it so that one day it could be tested. So no, it's still a viable case. Offender's probably dead. There's a sketch actually done by a Free Press courtroom artist, because this is pre-Identikit, which was the standardized stencil composite drawing system created by Smith & Wesson, ironically. So they used a court reporter to draw a sketch of the guy, and he would have been 30 at the time. So I mean, it's probably not solvable, but it was never solved. And this is the issue, especially in a place like London, where you do have these different factions who develop their own narratives, and everybody knew somebody who was connected to this somehow. And I mean, that was the case with these urban legends in London at the time too. Someone knew a cop who was connected to the case of like a babysitter who was, and until the internet, or until forums like this, they weren't immediately falsifiable or disprovable. So then they just
or they maybe not falsified or spread even farther on the internet, because you just don't know, right?
Well, right. But now we have, proper forums for people to go, and Snopes and things like that can, debunk some of these myths. But yeah, I mean, London was a wildfire gossip town, and still is.
The thing is,
The other two quickly that I was wanting to mention was, again, referring to Stephen Truscott. And again, he was a young kid, he was going to be hung, that things not worked out, and not that they ever, I think, really worked out for him. And the other one was a little more recent, was Donna Ogbock, who was found out in the Fanshawe area, in the northeast.
Donna's sister Tammy is amazing, fighting for her sister, and they managed to get back her purse, which was taken. as evidence. And of course, she didn't even have her purse with her that night. So the family was able to get that back. It's incredible. All the photos of Jackie English are still held by the OPP as well. And the family's not able to have those, which is upsetting. I think they should have them back. But when you were talking about community rumor and differentiating, I know for myself, community rumor has been an essential part of my work. Because if it wasn't for people talking about it, we wouldn't know about, for example, the Stanley Variety Store, which is crucial information, I think. So, you have to take those rumors, but you also have to try and verify them. That one in particular is pretty difficult to verify, but I know for myself, if I could go back and verify something in the archives, then I would use it. And then if I couldn't do that, then I would look at the source. For example, the person who confirmed Stanley Variety for me is a parole officer. So I felt very comfortable saying that that is a true story that he told me. But I also try to note this is a story. So for example, there's another story in my book where I used a pseudonym, Abigail, and that individual told me about an attempted abduction that happened to her in 1963. I believed her. Now I've had stories people told me that I did not believe, and I did not include those. But I believed her, so I put it in with the disclaimer that this is her story, and I could not verify it. The police officer who took the report has dementia, her mother has died, I could not verify it. So that's specific, but I think there's great value in that community memory, especially when we're talking about a period of policing that was as informal as it was.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. The 2 books are right here. You guys, if you haven't bought them, go and take a look and get them. And I want to thank Mike, I want to thank Vanessa, and thank all of you for being here today.
You were great. You were really good. Thank you. It's a real honor.
Hello.